What's up, guys? Today we're going to swap out the water pump, timing belt, and tensioner on my 2001 CRV. We're also going to change out all the accessory belts, front main seal, cam seals, tensioner spring, and also the valve cover gasket set. Now when choosing these parts, it's entirely up to you what you want to go with. I have some of my preferred parts that I like to use. If you're interested in any of those, click on one of the links in the description. I'll have those linked there, so if you want to purchase any of those, it's easy to get to. First thing you'll want to do is drain your radiator of all the coolant. While that's draining, we'll start removing some of the accessories on this side because this is where we need to get to. We're going to remove the cruise control unit first. The wiring you can just disconnect from the assembly itself. If you reach down here on the side, there's a little slide clip. If you push it towards the fender, this little clipper here, push it in and then slide this down. You can get that disconnected from the cruise control unit itself. Then remove the two 10mm bolts on the back side, and underneath you'll find another one right down in there. Then we can just kind of slide this out of the way. We're going to leave ours right there. Next we're going to remove the belt for the power steering. I'm going to take off the ground wire first. It's a 10 mil. You can remove this nut right here and get it out of the way. I'm just doing that for room. Plus we're going to remove it when we get to the valve cover. And then on the power steering pump, right down there, it's a 12mm bolt. That one is what tensions it. Once we loosen that, you can slide the pump back and forth. We're going to remove that one, and then this one on top here also is a 12mm. We're going to take both those out. That way we'll be able to slide the belt off the pump, and then we can just lift the power steering pump out of the way a little bit. I'm not sure how we're going to remove it with the reservoir as well. We're just going to see what we can do about getting a little bit more room so when we get to the cam gears and everything, it makes it a little bit easier. And with both those removed, so you now can move the power steering pump around. We can just go ahead and remove that belt. And once I remove the belt, with all that removed, what you can do now is slide the reservoir up out of the bracket itself, and then just slide the pump up and around from the core support, and we're just going to leave it over here. That way we have plenty of room to access the belt for the air conditioner, and then also once we get to all of the belt and pump itself. Now for the compressor belt, the compressor belt actually goes around the torque mount. So after we finish removing this, the coolant should now be done. Mine finished off. I'm going to go ahead and plug the radiator back up. Then we're going to work on getting these little plastic covers removed. Depending on what you have, some might have a little Phillips head screw, some might have like a little pop-in clip. Looks like they'd changed them before. We need to get this piece moved, and you'll find an assortment of either like little screws or possibly a bolt. We just need to get this down because we're going to be accessing everything in this area. I only had to remove 3. There was 2 here, and the third one was right here, connecting this plastic piece there. That gives us ample room to get to everything you need to get to. You can just kind of pry this out of the way, maybe put a jack or something there to hold it down if you need, but this is essentially all the room we need for down here. And to get the compressor belt loose, I have my socket on here already. There's a 12mm, it's like a bolt, which is attached to the bracket itself, which tightens the tensioner. We need to loosen that one first, and then over here, see this threaded rod with the nut on there? You're going to use another 12mm. This one will actually do second. Once we start to loosen that one, the pulley itself up here, which is tensioning the belt, it'll start to lower, then the belt will slide off. Once we slide the belt off, we're going to work on removing the torque mount and getting the motor mount removed. And now the AC belt's removed, we're going to work on the alternator belt really quick before we get to the torque mount. So at the bottom of it, bottom of the alternator, you'll see right in there, go ahead and loosen up this 14mm bolt. It doesn't need to be removed. Just loose, so that way we can loosen the tensioner one up top and then slide the alternator forward to get the belt off. And at the top of the alternator, right there's a 12mm nut, which you can go ahead and loosen that one as well. It does not need to be removed either, unless you're planning on removing the alternator. Just enough so it's loose and we can slide the alternator forward and get the belt off. With those loose, what I did, I just pushed the alternator forward, and that brings about the slack on the belt. So now we can get that one removed also. Next, we're going to support the engine with a hydraulic jack and a block of wood. We're going to get this side torque mount removed. You have a 19mm nut on the end of it. Then on the inside, you're going to have two 14mm bolts holding the torque mount to the frame. And with the torque mount off, you can now remove the compressor belt. Mine was in obvious need of repair, so if you're doing this job, think about potentially having these ready so you can replace them at the same time when we reinstall. And here's a quick look at all three of my belts. Let me just kind of bend them. It looks like they're a little old, they're all cracked, every single one. So it was definitely a good idea to get these changed now before they fail. And with the engine supported, now we're going to remove the mount. Sometimes this nut is very difficult to get off. These two are usually a little bit easier. So depending on what we can remove, if we cannot get this one removed, it might just be smarter to get off. There's these two 17mm nuts right here, and then around it, if those are removed, we can remove the 14mm which hold the mount to the body and then just pull it up as an entirety. I think I'm going to go ahead and do that instead of removing this nut here. And then with those removed, the mount should come out relatively easily. After getting here, I realized we're going to need to remove this 14mm bolt. It holds this little bracket which holds the power steering line. It's covering the valve cover right here, so we won't be able to pull the valve cover without removing that. So get that one off really quickly. Now we pretty much have full access to everything we need under the valve cover. You'll see down here the tensioner for the AC. This one, it actually can slide to this side now, so that way we can get the covers off. We're going to work on the crank pulley right now. One thing that I thought was really interesting is, can you guys see this little label down here? It looks like it still has like the sticker on it. It says the B20Z2 5035072. That's a good question. Let's find out. Okay, so I was looking at it. See the decal on the side here? The 5035072 says B20Z2. That covers both of the cam covers, the top one and the bottom one. So just for investigative purposes, I was looking, and if you look at my engine, let me zoom in there. 5035072. So it looks like, I doubt my timing belt and water pump have ever been changed, especially with the fact that that's still on there and it's connecting both of those covers. And I have quite a bit of miles on my CRV, 232,500 on the dot. So luckily this timing belt has never snapped. It's been way past the service interval, and that's why I wanted to change it. I've been driving my CRV for the last 11,000 miles. I got it at 221. I've been wanting to, but I've just been procrastinating, so that's why we're getting to it today. And it's kind of neat being able to see that it's never been changed, so I'm expecting an OEM Honda belt still on here. We'll kind of take a look at the condition of it as well, see if it looks like it's cracking or what it looks like in the shape. Okay, so after that, we're going to get the valve cover removed. We're not removing the crank pulley yet because after the valve cover is removed, we're going to spin it and get it lined up so that way it is at top dead center when we reinstall the new components, making it a lot easier to set timing. So get your valve cover and this little plenum box removed. This has a couple of 10mm bolts around it. There's 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't believe there's a 5th, no. And then you have the 10mm nuts surrounding the valve cover itself. There's 7 of them, 2 here, 3 in the middle, there's 1 underneath here, fifth one there. 6 and 7 are going to be right here underneath this little bracket also. So go and get that removed. This is something aftermarket I have on for my other car. You won't have this on your car usually, so you'll be able to access those really easily. So get all that removed. With the valve cover removed, we now want to spin the crank until we can get both of these lined up. You see how there's a little up arrow on each side. The arrows are kind of going to be facing up and to the left just a hair. And there's 2 little notches on the sides that we want to get to. I'm going to go ahead and remove this plastic cover. Just a couple of 10mm. They're both sticking out right here. Then we can see this a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to crank it from the pulley. I'm going to get this lined up and I want to show you what marks we're looking for. And after cranking it around, you'll see how these ups are both up and to the left a little bit? And you'll have two little marks there on the cam gears. There's one right below my thumb. The other was right below my thumb there. These actually match up to one another, and they line up with this little line that's on the cam gear cover itself. It basically lines all four of those little marks up with where the valve cover sits, the top of the head. And then the crank pulley, you'll see a little plastic mark on the cover itself, and it lines up with that single line on the crank pulley. You'll see the other three down here. Those are for when you're doing the ignition timing. But when you're just setting it to top dead center, that's exactly where you want it to be. Getting off the crank pulley can be very difficult, especially if you don't have the right tools. They make this crank pulley removal tool. This, you'll slide in wherever a position is good for you, and then you can attach like a breaker bar of some sort. That is usually ideal if you don't have access to some sort of electric impact. But what I prefer to use, which usually doesn't let me down, is the Milwaukee. And like I said, I don't know how difficult it would have been to get off without this thing, because like I said, 230,000 miles on this car. It does look like there's corrosion in little areas here and there, so it may have been a lot more difficult. This thing is a beauty. So now I'm gonna try to get the pulley off. Usually if you grab it and like kind of wiggle it, yeah, there we go. That came right off. And then don't forget the woodruff key. Whoops. It'll be on top as well. Get that out of there and set it aside just so you don't lose it. Now when you get the plastic cover removed, there's 4 bolts. There's 2 on this side, 1 here at the bottom. There's 1 up a little bit further up in here you can get to. You can kind of, it's right by the alternator up there. But get those 4 removed, then we can slide off that little cover. And I almost forgot, there was 1 more right here in the center. It's also a 10 mil. You see the 4 in the corners? Then there was that 1 more right there, and I just pulled it off and slid it right down. And now we're gonna get the timing belt removed. So to help, what you can do, you can put a couple screwdrivers, drill bits, something in here. This will help you keep your position on your cam gears. Then we need to remove the tensioner. So right there, where my finger's pointing to is a 14mm bolt. That's what holds the tensioner to the engine. We're gonna remove it a little bit and then pull the belt off, and then we'll just go ahead and remove the tensioner completely once we have the belt off. And after loosening it up, you can see it already left me some slack on the belt. So now I just like to pull it both sides, same time, and we can slide the belt right off. Here's a look at the old belt. You can vaguely see the Honda. I don't know if you guys can see it. It's right in this area right there. But I don't know, like the belt doesn't look that terrible. I've actually seen worse. But that just goes to show how well some of these parts can be engineered, and it's a better thing to replace them with OEM Honda parts as well. That way you're not questioning whether or not, or worrying whether or not it's going to break in the future. I'm going to start by changing the front main seal first. So we need to remove the 2 10mm bolts holding this little bracket and the sensor on there, and then we can pull off the gear for the crank. And then you can just pull it to the side, and then we can go ahead and remove that gear. And there we can see, it looks like mine is actually leaking. See the oil on the bottom of the seal? So another good idea to change any of these seals that we're getting to. So I'm going to start by removing this first seal. I usually will put a screwdriver in here and then pull towards the seal itself, spin a little bit, and usually will pop it right out. And for the new seal, I'll just go ahead and clean all the surrounding area, all the mating surfaces, and I'll go ahead and reinstall it. You may have some sort of tool to help put the seal in. I usually just kind of slide it on, wiggle it in. Then I'll use a small end of like a 1/4 inch, the extension off a 1/4 inch ratchet. I'll just kind of tap it in all the way around until I have it seated completely. And with the new seal installed on the crank, We're going to work on the camshaft seals next. You can leave these in there if you want. I will, just for keeping their position. I like to use a crescent wrench. The B20 and B18 non-VTEC heads have this little area here where you can actually attach it to. It makes it really easy to get the cam gears off. You don't have to have a cam lock of some sort. There's a tool on the Dock VTEC which you can actually slide in here, which will lock them into place because you don't have access to the cams like you do on these. But this makes it very easy to get these bolts out of the cam gear. And it's just like that. It's not too difficult. These aren't torqued all crazy, so you can get those removed relatively easily. We'll slide over to the exhaust one and do the same thing. And then you can go ahead and pull the cam gears off. When you pull them off, we just want to be careful we don't drop the wood drift key that's in there. So slide your gears off, and then we can slide the key out, and we'll just set those in a safe spot. And with the gears off, now we have access to both those seals. So get both those removed, and then go ahead and reinstall the new ones, just similar to the way we did on the bottom. Of course, clean the area up, install both of those, and then you can go ahead and put your cam gears back on. I'll try to remember to leave a link in the description, which will take you to a forum which has all of the torque specs for B series engines. That way you can kind of look up everything you want to on these particular engines. Now with the gears finished off, go ahead and remove the tensioner bolt and pull the tensioner and the spring off it. And then we're going to pull off the water pump. Here's the direction of the water pump on the engine. It has 5 10mm bolts that you need to remove. Get all 5 of those removed. They surround it, and then we're going to pull the water pump off of the engine. It might be like corroded on there a little bit, so you can kind of pull at it. You can even pry at the gear because we're no longer going to use the old one, so you can put like a little pry bar in there and kind of pull at it. But you'll find all the 5 bolts that are surrounding it. They're the ones that aren't threaded. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These other ones here are for the cover, the little black cover that goes on top of the water pump. And with those 5 removed, oh, there it is. Pulled a little bit, and you gotta be ready for that. It always makes a big mess from all this coolant that's still stuck in the water tube and in the back of the engine. But all I did was remove it a little bit, and off she comes. One thing to be careful of, the bolts on the water pump, you have 2 different sizes. See how this one's longer? So you end up having 2 longer ones and 2 shorter ones. The longer ones go on the very bottom and the top right, and the 3 shorter ones go in the rest. So that way when you're putting them back in, or if you've removed them and didn't pay attention, make sure you put them in the correct orientation. What I'm going to do now is kind of clean up the mating surface a little bit using some razor blades. Just try to clean off any corrosion that might be built up around it. Then we're going to go ahead and install the new gasket and get the water pump put on. It's up to you if you want to use some sort of RTV silicate. I usually will put a little bit on the gasket itself so it holds to the water pump better, so less chance of slippage when you're reinstalling it. And then you can go ahead and torque these. They are 7.2 foot-pounds of torque. What I found easiest to torque them was getting it from the bottom here. Started at one corner and went in the star sequence to tighten all those up. Now quickly just go ahead and reinstall your tensioner and spring. And then put the bolt in, and of course leave it loose because we still need to get the belt put on. This tensioner, it didn't seem that bad. I don't know if you watched a video of mine where I was working on a CRX. and I've spin this and you can hear the bearings. This one is tight, but it doesn't make the same kind of noise as that tensioner did in that previous video. And when you're putting the tensioner on, it only goes on one way. You'll see the bracket which connects to the little nipple that sticks off of the block, and the front part, you go ahead and attach it to the spring. Now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the gear. There was actually two Woodruff keys that were sticking on out of the crankshaft. So slide both of those in there. We're going to slide this on, and then we can go ahead and put the sensor back on after we have the crank gear on. And when we're putting it on, there's two different size bolts. The longer bolt goes through the side with the sensor. The shorter bolt goes through just the bracket side to the oil pump. Okay, and with the gear on the bottom, now it's time to put on the timing belt. So go ahead and start by putting the timing belt on the crank first. Wrap it around the tensioner, wrap it around the water pump, and have it ready up here so we can slide it up over the cam gears. Now I'm going to get the screwdrivers out. Looks like they're a little tight. Let me see if I can just rotate. Now I'm going to reinstall the cover. We're going to put on this outer belt guide, which goes on the gear. We're going to put back on the crank pulley. Then we're going to leave the top piece off. We're going to spin the engine a couple times. And we're going to check and make sure it lines up with TDC. So both cam gears line into position where it lines up on the crank pulley as well. So I'm recording this clip after I've completed the job because for some reason the clip that I recorded of me talking about tensioning the belt, it won't let me upload to my computer. So after you have the belt slid up onto the gears, what you want to do next is take your ratchet and start turning the engine. Of course you're going to crank it in its natural direction, and what that does, it'll effectively remove the slack on the front side of the belt, and it'll remove the slack here, and you only need to rotate it just a little bit. So once we do that, it pulls all the slack on those two sides, and it leaves the slack over on this side of the belt, which is great because you can go ahead and tighten the tensioner now, and that'll help remove the slack. Then you can go about continuing checking your rotation on the gears and the crank pulley and making sure everything lines up correctly. Okay, and after you have the cover on, you've reinstalled the crank pulley, 130 foot-pounds. Let's go ahead and crank it a couple times to see if the cam gear marks line up with the pulley mark. And after spinning it a couple times and re-verifying that everything lines up where it should, the two marks on the sides of the cam gears, you can kind of tell, let me see if I can back up, these are kind of both up and to the left a little bit, the way that the top of the cam gears are facing. And then at the crank pulley, you can see the little dash, it lines up with the notch on the plastic cover. So the timing's set. I went ahead and tightened the tensioner already. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put the little black cover on for the cam gears. And then we're going to go ahead and reinstall the belts. You're going to want to do them in the order of alternator first because that's the inner belt. And then you're going to do the air compressor, I was going to say air compressor, but the AC, the compressor, the second one. And then lastly, you're going to do your power steering. So we're going to get all this put together. And what I'm going to do, since I have all this out before putting the valve cover on and sealing the corners with RTV, I'm going to perform a valve adjustment. I'll show you how to do that really quickly, just on a couple of valves. I'll do it on one set. We go in the order of 1, 3, 4, 2 when lining it up with the marks on the cam gear. And it's necessary to do that since it's been so many miles on this car. It can only help, and that way you don't have a burnt valve. I guess Seems like a lot of people have issues with their CRVs and the B20s burning valves, or valve adjustment needing to be done more frequently than others. So I'm going to go ahead and get that out of the way. It'll only take me another 30 minutes to perform that, since I'm already here, without having to take off all of these accessories again on a different day. With the alternator belt on, easiest way to do this, I use a pry bar and I slide it between the bracket and the alternator itself. Then you can kind of pull it and tension it, and then go ahead and tighten up the 12mm on top. Once that one's tight and you're happy with the tension, you can go ahead to the bottom and tighten up the 14mm nut. Now, in terms of tension on a belt, say for instance, let's use this one. When a belt is tightened like this, you're looking at the amount of deflection. So the area in between, when you squeeze it down, I usually tighten it to the point where I can push it down maybe about 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 inch. I leave about that much deflection in terms of tightness on the belt. That way it's not overly tight, or it's not loose where it's going to create noise. And that amount of deflection usually seems to work perfectly fine for me. And then with the compressor belt on, you'll see that there's a lot of slack. If you're unfamiliar with how this works, this little threaded stock right here, once we spin this back in, it's going to go back into this mount, and it lifts this pulley right here, which eliminates the slack. And then you tighten up the lock nut, and then you tighten up that bolt right here. That bolt actually connects to this arm which holds the pulley, so those two lock it into place. So go ahead and remove the slack from the compressor belt. At this point now, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the motor mount and the torque mount. Now go ahead and reinstall the power steering pump and reservoir. Slide them into position. Then we'll get the belt put on first, and then we'll go ahead and tighten up the bracket one, and then the bolt for the tensioning. Now I have the belt on, and I have both of the bolts sort of tightened. Now to tension it, you'll see right here, see this little area? This fits a 1/2 inch socket. I don't have one, so I'm just using an extension, which is a reducer, which works on my 3/8 drive. So what you can do, crank it like you're actually cranking it loose, and you'll see how it moves the entire assembly forward. You see the tensioning bolt move back and forth. So slide it to where you want it, where you're happy with the tension, and then go ahead and tighten that bolt down there. Then you can finish up by tightening up the top bolt on the power steering bracket. Now if you're curious, I use some Continental belts. These are supposed to perform better, supposed to last longer, not run as hot. Got them off Rock Auto, and they were pretty inexpensive. It was only like 35 bucks shipped for all three. They're a lot more expensive just buying like a generic one at AutoZone. They're like $16 to $20 for a single one there. So you save money by doing that, and plus these are supposed to be a nicer belt. And I'm shooting for longevity with these particular belts. That's why I went with this brand. At this point you can go ahead and re-add all of your coolant. And then with finishing that, all I gotta do is put your cruise control assembly back in. Very easy, just the 3 bolts, those 10 mils, and then plug the clip back in. We're essentially done. If you're about to wrap it up now and not do a valve adjustment, you could just apply the RTV on the corners, and then put your valve cover back on, put that air plenum back on, and call it a day. I'm going to go ahead and do a valve adjustment. I'm not going to put in this video just for sake of time, but if you want to know how to do it, in the upper corner, click this video and skip to the 23-minute and 20-second mark. I did it on another B20 that was in my other car, and I explain it in detail how to do it from the beginning to the end. So if you want to do a valve adjustment, go ahead and watch that video up here in the corner, and that'll take you all the way through just performing a valve adjustment. With the valve adjustment done, the last seal we're going to change is this seal on the end of the cam. You have 4 10mm bolts. These are on the ends of the corners. Go ahead and remove all 4 of those. And when you're trying to get this off, it's not that easy, it just doesn't come off. I was taking a hammer and I was just kind of tapping lightly on both sides, trying to loosen it. I finally got to the point where I could wiggle it, and I was able to pull it off. Then you can go ahead and pull that seal off, clean any of the surfaces. What I'll do, I'll apply some RTV silicone all the way across here, down the bottom, all the way across this corner here. That way we can make sure it bonds and it seals it off completely. And then go ahead and put that cap back on and then torque all of those to 7 foot-pounds of torque. Now I'm about to put the valve cover on. Went ahead and applied the new gaskets for the spark plugs, the valve cover itself. What I will do next, I will apply the RTV in all of the corners here where the cam caps are. So on those 2 corners, 2 there, 2 right there, 2 there. Then we'll go ahead and put the valve cover on. With the valve cover on, don't forget this little bracket. Then put on the bolts. And we're going to torque them to 7.2 foot-pounds. It goes in this order. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Put any tubes you may have pulled off the PCV valve back in. Go ahead and bring over that weird little air box. Goes on top. And then just tighten all those up. I don't think it's necessary to torque those. Just tighten them up snug. We're good to go. Put your spark plugs back in. And then lastly, you can go ahead and put up your plastic cover again. And that pretty much wraps it up, guys. Go ahead and start it up. Make sure you don't have any weird issues, weird noises, squeaking belts. Kind of give it a good look through. Oh, I almost forgot. This little bolt for this little bracket for the power steering. That's easy. I'll just bolt that up really quickly. But that'll wrap it up. If you guys have any questions at all, any sort of comments, any kind of helpful tips, leave them in the comments below. I appreciate when you guys do. It kind of helps build onto this video by adding more information for somebody else. And then if you have any information regarding the products, you can look at some of my links in the description. You can pick some of those products up yourself if you want those particular items. But that wraps this job up, guys. I'll get out here on the next day. I want to do a couple more things to try to get my CRV up to speed in terms of maintenance. I hope this helps you guys out. Hope you guys appreciate the video, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.